Good afternoon. My name is Anna Godoy, and I'm a postdoc here at CWED. And we have a session now about other adjustment channels, downstream effects on children. We're going to have 3 speakers and 2 discussants, so a similar format to what we had earlier. So our first speaker is Bill Spriggs. He's a professor and former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University. He's the chief economist at the AFL-CIO. Next up, we're going to have Lindsay Bullinger. She's a PhD candidate in public policy analysis and public finance at Indiana University. Her research focuses on poverty and inequality and how social welfare policy contributes to the health and well-being of children and families. Then we're going to have Will Dow. He's a professor of health economics at the School of Public Health here at Berkeley. His research analyzes economic aspects of health insurance, health behaviors, and health and demographic outcomes. Then we're going to have 2 discussants, and I'll introduce them now as well. So Arindrajit, who we already heard from a little bit, he's, as been mentioned earlier, one of the co-founders of CWED. He is now an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts. And then we have Rachel West, who also used to work here at CWED. She used to be a graduate student researcher. And she is now the Associate Director of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress in DC.
Okay, thank you. And I apologize, Aaron didn't see the slides, but he had the paper a long 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to talk about the minimum wage, and really I'm the odd person on the panel because mine sort of is responding to the work that Ben and others are doing. And this is an insight into 2 aspects of the minimum wage. One is an attempt to define the set of jobs that are tied to the minimum wage using a different perspective than you have seen so far. And then, in honor of Michael, to then draw this out as thinking of this as a dual labor market. But if you do, then there are clear implications for that. So the work that I did with Bruce Klein initially was to establish that there was a minimum wage contour. And by a minimum wage contour, we mean jobs that high school educated workers get, their starting wage moves with the minimum wage. The insight for that came because my very first job was as a sales clerk at Sears Roebuck. And when they hired us, they were quite explicit. We are paying you 15 cents above the minimum wage. They were quite explicit about that, 15 cents above the minimum wage. So they had clearly pegged it. And in fact, when I started this work, the problem is that the org doesn't go back that far. So I couldn't capture when I was in high school and had this job in the 60s. But while we were increasing the minimum wage in steps, sure enough, in the retail sector, it was 15 cents above the minimum wage. That was in retail. And it followed that way for quite a while. And so that was the insight that there must be a cluster of jobs where there are other employers who are doing the exact same thing. And so this was a cluster analysis using industry and occupation cells, because clearly within some industries, there are some low-wage jobs, and those workers are probably not being paid according to productivity increases broadly, but with some reference to some minimum wage, a wage norm. And so we tracked from the 70s through the 90s on an annual basis, taking people who were 1 to 10 years out of high school, what's their wage, and then how do those wages in those cells move with either the minimum wage or the average wage, which was going up with productivity. And sure enough, there were 2 clear, distinct clusters that developed, and we labeled one the minimum wage contour because all these starting wages were correlated with the minimum wage, and the others were clearly correlated with the movement in average wages. One of the questions we looked at in the paper was, Why during the 70s, when we had a recovery, versus the 80s recovery, did the wages of high school educated workers go up versus in the 80s, when that recovery, the wages of high school educated workers went down? And you could not explain it simply using standard decompositions by industry shifts, by shifts in occupation, by shifts in region. There were some demographic shifts because white workers, even then, comparing the 70s to the 80s, were becoming a smaller share of the workforce. You couldn't explain it that way. There was something else going on. And one of the observations was this, that the share of workers who were on that minimum wage contour kept going up every time the real value of the minimum wage went down. Now, this is not the labor shifting that sometimes people think of. You know, they often think, oh, well, these workers are cheaper, so I'm going to hire more high school educated workers than college educated workers. We know that wasn't happening during the 80s. But what was happening is that, yes, these workers are cheaper, and the way I'm going to organize work is we will organize work around more of those workers and less of those workers who would get paid tied to the average wage. So what was happening is, not only are you pulling down the starting wage of workers, I keep, oh, don't step on that, that's the key. Okay, so, it's not just that we're pulling down their wages because the starting wage is pegged to the minimum wage and the real value of the minimum wage is falling, it's also that we're going to create more of those jobs. So if you come out of high school, the jobs that you're going to face are going to be increasingly the low-wage jobs, not the average wage jobs. And just to give you an example, this is non-durable manufacturing. And from 73 to 79, when we had recovery, the value of the minimum wage had been going up. And you see that, yeah, firms did hire a few more handlers. Craft and repair, which are the higher skilled type of jobs that you would imagine a high school educated worker getting. All of these are high school educated workers. This is not shifting between college workers. This is just, I'm hiring a high school educated worker. What am I going to hire them to do? And craft and repair went up. In the 80s, when the value of the minimum wage is falling, I don't want those craft and repair workers because I can do this with cheaper workers. Some of the way I'm organizing work is better to use the handlers. And so within the industry, you saw handlers go up. And it's odd in the 80s that you would see handlers go up and craft and repair fall, because after all, you would think that there was even more technological change in manufacturing going on in the 80s and should have continued. And my demand really should have been, I want to organize work with the craft and repair workers, but you see the share falls from 13% down to 8%. I'm hiring more handlers. That's what we were beginning to find, that I'm being punished twice. You're lowering my starting wage, and the type of jobs that you're creating for me to choose from are lower wage jobs, not higher wage jobs. So that was the insight. Now, there's this component that Michael has brought up in his work before, and that clearly the people who tended to get the jobs on the minimum wage contour looked like a dual labor market. They are the suspects of a dual labor market. A larger share of women, and as the real value of the minimum wage went down, a larger share, these are people with the same educational attainment, a larger share of high school educated women were on the minimum wage contour. If you only looked at minimum wage, that is people, that's the very bottom line, the little dotted line, that's people on or at the minimum wage. And you can see the minimum wage looks like in the 80s, it's not very important because as it fell in real value, it also lost its ability to be the real standard by which people could judge a wage. And as Ben and them are going to find out, it means that the bunching that you would get, and we used to get when the minimum wage was binding and we had a high minimum wage, so it was binding at the bottom, it fell apart because firms were losing that reference point because the real value of the minimum wage was falling so much, it didn't make sense for a lot of firms. They could no longer say, I'm going to pay you 15 cents above the minimum, because now 15 cents above the minimum didn't have the same meaning. The real value was so low by the time you get to the end of the 1980s, it just didn't mean anything. So that's why you see such a small share of workers at or below the minimum wage, because by that time, firms had to use some other reference. They had to come up with some way to figure out, what am I going to pay somebody who's starting out? But that contour still existed, and women were more likely to be on it, and blacks and Latinos were far more likely to be on that minimum wage contour. And as the real value of the minimum wage continued to fall, they were the ones who increasingly got jobs on that contour. Very much a dual labor market story. If I'm going to, these are the groups I discriminate against anyway. What is it that I'm discriminating against them from? It's from access to the jobs that go up with productivity. They're getting the jobs that can only be bargained with from increases in the minimum wage. Now, a lot of what goes on, and what I had a deep objection to in the CBO study, CBO at the very end says, okay, well, we did all these reports, and in fact, they go through great length to say they looked at the Zipper, Dube, Reich, Allegretto paper, and they think that's the gold standard and that's how you should do it. But we still think there must be some effect, and therefore we declare that there are some workers who are so inherently unskilled with no evidence, but we will assert that there are such people, and we will give a number to them, even though they give no factual basis for it. There are such people, and therefore they will be jobless. This is what they did. The other paper that Aaron was to read was to actually look at that question. Are there such people? Who are these people on that minimum wage contour? And is it that their skill really does justify that, yes, that's where they're there, we can kind of believe that they're the least skilled? When you look at the wage gap in the paper that I did, when you look at that wage gap and just do OLS on those people, you find that you don't explain very much. It looks very much like trying to explain the black-white wage differential, which should be a hint that it probably really is discrimination, and that's why you're there. But we use the NLSY so we could use fixed effects. Now, the problem with fixed effects is now all of a sudden we've taken all these people who are disproportionately black, female, and Latino, and we've said now we're going to use fixed effects. Well, now I've netted out discrimination, so to speak. But we found that there was an unexplained wage gap for people on the minimum wage contour, suggesting that in fact they did have skills that would warrant them getting paid more money, and that gap increased as the real value of the minimum wage went down. That their wages, as predicted, you're on the minimum wage contour, your wages are being tied to what the minimum wage is doing, they were being sucked down, and their wage gap that we could explain got smaller. The wage gap we could not explain kept getting bigger, until we reached 1991, when we raised the minimum wage. And then you see that we start to, which was your question, does this shrink those gaps? And it did shrink those gaps between what we could explain, why are you on this minimum wage contour? Everything held constant, including your individual characteristics, your unobserved individual characteristics. And no, we in fact could shrink those by raising the minimum wage. The other thing we found was that people move between the minimum wage contour, and when you raise the minimum wage, in fact, there are more people who get kicked from the minimum wage, and the next time you see them, they're on the average wage contour. That is, they take a job, like in that previous slide, they go from being a handler to, I'd rather hire you as a craft worker. I need more of those. The relative prices have changed, and this is the problem with dual labor markets, right? If dual labor markets were so good, then why don't firms favor the low wage? And what we were finding is, yes, they do. They favor that low wage path. If you raise the wage of that contour, then I'm not going to favor the low wage path, and I'm going to create more jobs on the average wage contour. This helps the workers who are on the minimum wage contour because of discrimination. They're pushed into that dual labor market. But it also helps them in the other way, which is that now it is even more likely that I'm going to put you in the average wage contour. So this was interesting because when Germany raised their minimum wage, the fear was that the response would be all the women who are going to benefit from the higher minimum wage, the fear was, well, they're going to get non-standard work contracts. The companies will just avoid the minimum wage altogether. The reality was, once the German government said, you know what, you're going to have to pay this minimum wage, in fact, the firms did exactly this. They said, we're going to put more workers on standard wage contracts, and we're going to get fewer workers on the non-standard contracts. Why? Because if I have to pay you that much money, now I actually need something out of you. I can't treat you as throwaway. You need to do something different. This is a component that I think is missing in our analysis of the minimum wage. It actually affects the structure of the jobs that are offered, and it affects the structure of the jobs that take place. If I'm going to have workers who are going to stay longer because I don't have the same job turnover, if I have to pay them more money, I want you to do different things. This is not switching college for low skilled. This is taking people with the same skills and saying, how can I use you differently? And I think that's a component that we need to have as our way of thinking of this. And if we go back to the dual labor market literature, I think we can understand, we can better understand the big anomaly that I mentioned before. Why could a 16-year-old in real terms get a higher wage in 1968 than the current set of workers who have associate's degrees? In the Fed Up campaign, we have people with associate's degrees, the best they can handle is getting a job in retail, paying slightly above the minimum wage. Why? Because they are the same set of workers in terms of race and gender. But in that time period, from the 60s to today, those workers are far better educated. So this has a deeper meaning when you look at it from the dual labor market perspective. And I think it gives you a different theoretical framework to test against when you think about the minimum wage.
All right, thank you all for making it through this afternoon. My name is Lindsay Bullinger. I'm a PhD candidate at Indiana University, and today I'll be talking about how the minimum wage can affect child maltreatment. This work was published in the January issue of Children and Youth Services Review, and is co-authored with Carrie Racine, who's at the University of Connecticut. So why child maltreatment? I'm going to start here because this is a very different paper than what we've seen up until this point today. So child maltreatment in the United States is a far bigger problem than probably most people realize. So just in terms of numbers, almost 3.5 million child maltreatment referrals occur per year, and specifically 3.4 in 2015. A paper came out earlier this year that identified, does the clicker work? That identified 37% of children are the subject of an investigation by Child Protective Services agencies at some point in their childhood. So this is a pretty substantial number of children. This is about 1 in every 2.5 children. So again, probably a bigger problem than most people realize. As someone who comes from a child welfare researching background, this isn't necessarily surprising, but now that we have a number to put, a statistic to put to what most caseworkers and social work and child welfare researchers already knew, this is pretty exciting stuff, in a negative way, of course. We also know that child maltreatment leads to some pretty serious consequences in adulthood. So specifically, there's been research done to show that child maltreatment leads to higher rates of depression in adulthood, worse health, greater rates of employment, higher use of social services, and children who are maltreated are more likely to commit crimes later in life. And I want to point out that these are all causal studies here. So these are not just merely correlations between children who grow up in households where they were the victim of abuse. And there's a lot of other stuff going on that then subsequently might be correlated with these long-term outcomes these are all based on causal studies, so really isolating the effects of child maltreatment on later in life outcomes. I also want to clarify really quickly throughout the rest of this talk, I will be referring to child maltreatment. What I mean by child maltreatment includes physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. Neglect is by far the most common type of child maltreatment. We also know that children from low-income families are at a greater risk of child maltreatment than children in higher-income families. And in particular, children from single female-headed households are at the highest risk of child maltreatment. But there's a lot of other stuff going on with children and families in low-income households that aren't going on necessarily with children in higher-income households. And so there are a lot of other potential confounders if one wants to understand the relationship between income and child maltreatment. And as a result, causal evidence for the relationship between income and child maltreatment risk is quite scarce. A few papers have come out in the last 2 years that have really tried to identify the effects of income on child maltreatment, and that was part of the motivation for this paper. There is reason to believe that there is potentially a causal mechanism between income and risk of child maltreatment. So we call the first pathway the direct mechanism. So this would be where a higher income household has a greater ability to provide basic needs for children, things like clothing, food, shelter, medical care. And these things, the lack of all of those characteristics would actually constitute neglect. So it might actually be a direct way through which income affects child maltreatment. There are also potentially indirect mechanisms through which income could potentially affect child maltreatment. We know that economic hardship can generate stress, depression, poor psychological well-being, and increased risk of substance abuse. And those things all are risk factors for child maltreatment and poor child health. Additionally, income could be either a cause or a consequence of family structure and the household situation in which a child is raised. And so these household structures might then subsequently impact the time constraints available for parenting, stress, and other types of family conflict. The minimum wage is a policy that is at least designed to be helpful for low-income families, and much of the literature shows that it is. With very few exceptions, the minimum wage has been found to substantially improve the financial situation of those households that are in poverty, especially households with children. And I like this quotation from former U.S. Secretary of Labor Thomas Perez, that the typical minimum wage earner is most likely a woman who is running a household and raising children. So given the substantial overlap between the types of people that people and households that would be benefiting from an increase in the minimum wage, and those who are most at risk of perpetrating child maltreatment, we wanted to know, my co-author Carrie Racine and I wanted to know, do changes in the minimum wage affect child maltreatment risk? So to answer this question, we put together a couple of sources of data here. The first is child maltreatment record data. So these come from the National Child Abuse and Neglect Database. This is a database that's housed at the National Clearinghouse at Cornell University. And these are case-level records of child maltreatment reports that are reported to Child Protective Services or child welfare agencies. And they include, so it's case level, so there could be more than one for each child. So these include demographic information about the child. In some states, they include information about perpetrator, though we do not use that information because it's not available for all states. These records also include the type of maltreatment that was alleged. For example, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. We also know whether the report was substantiated or not. And so using this information, we constructed a rate, a maltreatment rate by age and also by maltreatment type. We put together then a state quarter panel of maltreatment rates by age and state, starting in 2004 all the way through 2013. And the reason we start in 2004 is because most states, contributing to the federal clearinghouse is not a requirement, so not all states do, though starting in 2004, most states start consistently reporting their data to the federal clearinghouse, though North Dakota and Oregon did not until 2012, so they are omitted from this study. We chose to do a state quarter panel because two reasons. One, some minimum wage effective dates are in July, and sometimes they're in October. And we also wanted a way to better capture the seasonal variation in reports of child abuse. So, for example, during the summertime, reports of child abuse drop because teachers are mandated reporters. So we supplement those data with minimum wage effective dates at the state level. And so here we use the greater of the federal minimum wage and the state minimum wage in each state in each quarter. And then we convert those into real minimum wage dollars in 2005. There are a lot of things that might be potential confounders here. A lot of things might be correlated with both child maltreatment risk and also the state's minimum wage level. And so we control for a variety of these controls. Our empirical strategy is fairly straightforward. I didn't step on it, so maybe it's not that. We have a pretty straightforward empirical strategy here where we're estimating the relationship between minimum wage in a given state quarter and its that same state quarter's child maltreatment rate, again by age and maltreatment type. We control for a variety of those state-level controls that I just briefly went over. We've also got state and quarter fixed effects in here. And the last component that we have here is a state-specific, in this case, linear trend, though I should point out that we also had quadratic and cubic trends here. It didn't matter. But the reason we include that is because, as we've talked about a good deal today, those parallel trends assumptions are quite important for studying the effects of minimum wages, and this inclusion of this particular component in this model relaxes that assumption, so it allows different trends for different states. In the end, what we are able to walk away with this model is this is a plausibly causal interpretation if unobservable factors that are related to child maltreatment risk do not deviate from a state's trend in child maltreatment risk when the minimum wage changes in that given state. Okay, so I mean, it's debatable whether you want to interpret these effects as causal or if a little bit more conservative approach would be an association, but we've interpreted these as causal largely because of this last caveat here. So moving into the results, I wanted to present really pretty graphs that were much more visually appealing, but alas, I did not end up having time. So you get a bunch of numbers at you, but that's okay. We'll get through it. So what this first table shows us is the risk of maltreatment for all children. So reports to Child Protective Services agencies, regardless of the age, separated out by type of maltreatment that's alleged. And what we see here is that an increase in the minimum wage reduces the report rate for all children. This is marginally significant, so it's merely suggestive here. But what we do see is that these effects, or this relationship, is really driven by neglect. Okay, neglect is the driving factor here, rather than these other types of abuse, and no effects here for substantiation rate or removal rate here being a very extreme measure of child maltreatment. So this equates to about a reduction of 9% roughly when we compare that to the mean. When we break these effects out by child age, they're much stronger for young children here. So again, we see this reduction in the report rate of child maltreatment, regardless of maltreatment type alleged, by about 10%. And that, again, is largely driven by reduction in neglect reports, again, by about 10 or 11%. Still, we see no observed relationship between an increase in the minimum wage and other types of maltreatment. When we look at school-aged children, so these would be children between the ages of 6 and 12, we see a very similar pattern, though, among neglect rates, but the relationship with total reports is no longer statistically different from 0. But again, this is about equivalent to a 9% reduction, so very consistent effects here. Oops. By the time we reach adolescent children here, those effects go away. There are many reasons that we argue or believe that this might be the case, and I'm happy to talk about those in a second. I'm skipping through our robustness checks, but we do a couple of different things to verify the robustness of our results. Happy to talk about that later, but I'm down to 2 minutes. So. What we learned from this study is that an increase in the minimum wage reduces the risk of child welfare involvement. Specifically, a $1 increase in the minimum wage reduces the rate of child maltreatment reports by about 10%. And nationwide, this is about 9,700 fewer reports of child maltreatment. We see that the results are driven by reductions in reports of neglect, and especially among young and school-aged children. And this finding here really makes us think that the mechanism here is through that direct pathway that I discussed earlier. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. For what it's worth, these results are consistent with other policies. If you're interested in how the minimum wage compares to other policies such as the EITC or increases in household incomes as a result of child support enforcement. So there are a lot of things that we were unable to do with this particular study that we are hoping to dig a little bit deeper into when we continue this work. And so a work in progress right now, again, with Carrie Racine and also a colleague, William Schneider, who's at Northwestern University. We have some work in progress where we are really trying to dig deeper into these results. One of the goals of this next paper is to explore the effect of city-level minimum wages. Is it city-level? Do city-level minimum wages differ from the effects of state minimum wages? And the second goal of this extension of this work is to really identify those mechanisms. So is it that minimum wages reduce adverse parenting behaviors, or that they increase positive behaviors, or some combination of both? And we also are able to then identify parenting behaviors that might precede child welfare involvement. So things like reading to children or other types of adverse behaviors. And we can do that because we're using individual level data. And I'm happy to talk about any more of this. One other point is we're able to identify then differences between rural and urban areas, which was a comment that had come up earlier. So we're really hoping to get a lot more out of this next paper now that we have this first paper out there. Thanks.
Okay. So thank you again to the organizers for inviting me and for you all for sticking around late into the afternoon. So I'm going to be talking about health effects of minimum wages, or what we think we know and what we'd like to know. This literature is very underdeveloped, and I'm going to be building on what sort of Lindsay was just talking about in some ways, although my presentation is a little bit different because I'm not going to actually be presenting my own empirical work here. What I'm going to be doing is just a little bit more of a survey of what's been done out here. I've done more work that's sort of related, looking at the quasi-experimental effects of other types of income variation on health. And so we'll talk a little bit about what we might expect based on that larger body of literature. And then I'll talk about what we have learned so far from the handful of studies that are really looking specifically at minimum wages and health. There I go, I started. So we can just start by thinking about some of the mechanisms. And I'm really going to be focusing on short-run mechanisms here because most of the literature that's looking at income variation isn't really looking at the long-term effects of sort of changing income on health, even though we know that so many health effects occur with long lags, which is one of the challenges in this literature, right? So there's the direct income effects, the first thing that people think about. When you talk about health, people often go right to health care. Okay, so you have more money, that you're going to be able to afford co-pays better, you might be able to utilize more care, you might be getting onto better insurance. Oftentimes there's a movement from Medicaid into some kind of private insurance plan, though the direct income effects on uninsurance are a little bit more ambiguous in general. But we also know that only about 15% of sort of avoidable morbidity and mortality, sort of premature morbidity and mortality are related to healthcare. Much of that is associated with behaviors and exposures sort of outside the four walls of a healthcare system that healthcare can actually avoid, help prevent. And so stress is one of the things that we talk about. So there's physiological stress. There are lots of different pathways through which stress just sort of gets under the skin and causes ill health. But stress also affects behaviors, coping behaviors, such as smoking, right? So we might think that if minimum wages raise income, that it could actually lead to some reduced smoking through these kinds of stress-type channels. We also often talk about nutrition in low-income populations. So food insecurity is a big issue for many folks in this country still. But we also have the dual problem in this country of obesity. And there's a concern that health is a normal good. Raising income is going to lead to increased demand for health, but it's also going to lead to increasing demand for all sorts of inputs, including different types of foods, and as well as sin goods such as tobacco. But there's going to be, it's been a little bit more work around obesity, so I'll be mentioning some of the potential adverse effects on obesity that we've seen actually in some of this literature. There's also, people talk about potential pathways related to time allocation. I'm not going to say very much about it. We don't have a whole lot that I think we know about that in relation to health behaviors yet. And then there's price effects is another thing that we talk about. In particular, what I'll build on drawing from one of the studies in the literature is that as minimum wages go up, that can raise prices of some types of foods, particularly in the fast food sector is where we think that there's most likely to be some substantial impacts on prices. And so those prices may actually affect fast food demand, and there could be reductions in fast food consumption. Okay, so let's think about what we know about related research beyond minimum wages, just in quasi-experimental variation in sort of income. And I'm going to separate out what we've learned about adults from what we've learned about children, because the literatures are somewhat different. So for adults, as in everything around the minimum wage, of course, identification is challenging, and the same thing is true. There just aren't that many great natural experiments with sort of income increases in different adult ages that we can nail sort of really good estimates. But those studies that we have actually have very conflicting results. So we have a handful of results where we're seeing increased income leading to better health outcomes. Okay, so things like lotteries, which not directly related to minimum wages, not really exactly the same population if we're going to make inferences about this. There's been a number of different papers around pension reforms. Okay, so some of those pension reform papers have suggested that pension reforms are leading to improved adult health outcomes, but we've had a number which are suggesting possibly negative health outcomes. So probably best known in this room would be the Snyder and Evans work on the Social Security notch, where it looks like increased Social Security income is related to actually worse mortality. Okay, and so there are various pathways one could talk about. There's also been various work around earned income tax credits. So the one paper looking most closely at EITC and health is by Schmeiser in 2009, who looked at obesity and found that EITC increases were associated with fairly large increases in obesity. If you take the point estimate seriously, they can explain like 20% of their increase in obesity over the time period that he was looking at, sort of through the 90s. So it's really big adverse effects. But we also have work from, say, the Progreso Oportunidades program in Mexico, which is a large conditional cash transfer program that had fairly good quasi-experimental variation or natural variation built into the rollout of the program. And we see there as well that as households were getting more money, we're seeing increases in obesity among adults. And so this isn't just sort of a one-off. There are real strong papers out there suggesting that income can have adverse effects on adults, and others suggesting possibly good effects. Well, when we talk about children, it's actually less ambiguous. The literature is still challenging to estimate sort of great causal effects, but those estimates that we have all suggest that more income is improving health of kids. All right? So people here are probably familiar with Hilary Hoyne's EITC work published a couple of years ago, suggesting improved birth weight, lower incidence of low birth weight children. There's some work that I've been doing looking at obesity for kids goes down when you have income associated with casino openings and expansions. In other developing countries, all of these studies are suggesting that we're seeing more income is a good thing, as one might suggest. So on kids, it's not really ambiguous. It's more a question of effect sizes that we want to be thinking about. All right, so what do we know about studies actually looking at minimum wage changes and health for adults? Well, again, the literature isn't huge, but it is expanding slowly. The studies that are out there aren't great methodologically in general. So there's a lot of state year difference in difference type studies that aren't really sort of going the next steps to sort of the frontier of the methods that are being used in labor economics at this point. So I think there's a huge opportunity out there. So in terms of the results, on the benefit side, there's a paper by David Meltzer and colleague Chen that was published in an NBR book a few years ago using state year difference and differences, found that another paper, so the Meltzer and Chen found that there was lower BMI, and I'll talk more about that study in a moment. Another paper by Reeves just came out in Health Economics this year, finding improved mental health, reduced financial stress in the UK. When the UK phased in their sort of minimum wage in 1999, there was another study looking at the UK that found improved self-reported health. But those UK studies are limited because there's no geographic variation, right? So essentially what they're doing is taking a panel of individuals and following them over time, people who started just above or below the new sort of minimum wage threshold. And there's lots of threats to validity that we sort of worry about. So again, it's interesting evidence, but you're not going to take that one to the bank. But again, there are a number of studies that are showing some adverse effects of minimum wages. So there's an NBR working paper that came out last year by sort of Horn et al., which is again state year difference and difference kind of thing, that found that increasing minimum wages are associated with reduced general health status, self-reported general health status, so more fair or poor health. And they were suggesting it has to do with some kind of work stress kind of hypothesis, but they didn't have any data to really nail the mechanisms. And there's a big multiple testing problem in this particular paper. I mention it because it's one of the few papers out there that looks at adults. So I want to be fair to talk about it, but I have a lot of concerns about that paper. The effect sizes are actually quite small, and we only see them among men, not women, so lots of caveats. There's also a better done paper that came out in Restat in 2012 looking at alcohol-related teen traffic fatalities, finding that they were increasing when minimum wages are increasing. So this had some potential pathways around alcohol being a sort of normal good. The effect sizes were actually quite small. They're estimating a 10% increase in minimum wage would maybe cause 100 deaths per year, which is a bad thing, but in the big scheme of things, that's just not humongous, and they suggested that some well-targeted beer taxes could actually sort of offset that if one wanted to. All right, so in terms of the Meltzer and Chen piece, let me just spend a little bit more time on this. I think it's one of the more interesting of those papers that I just talked about. So they found that declining minimum wages over the several decades is associated with increased BMI. They argue it's not really an income effect because they're actually finding they're not finding bigger effects at the lower incomes. Right? So what they argue is that this is some kind of a price effect having to do with fast food prices going up because the number that they use is about a third of the cost of fast food may be associated with minimum wage labor. Chatting with some folks here, they say that's maybe a bit of an overestimate, but this is the pathway that they argue is going on. When we talk about effect sizes, they argue that this could explain about 10% of BMI increases over the last several decades, if you take their point estimates. So essentially, a $1 minimum wage increase can lower BMI by 0.07 units, which is, if you use their estimates, that's about 15 days of life that would lead to extension. And you take some typical $100,000 per quality adjusted life year number and you sort of monetize that, and that's about $50 billion per year welfare gain. So in the spirit of what Larry was talking about earlier, right? So this is a little bit less unambiguous, that this is sort of a clear welfare gain. You're sort of going these downstream health effects. We can argue about the number, but they were arguing that this is actually a very large compared to the wage transfers that are occurring from firms to workers when you increase the minimum wage. At this time period, they used a number like $200 billion. So $50 welfare gain off of a $200 billion transfer. That's a big number, suggesting that these health effects, they're not just sort of window dressing on the side to try to, convince someone who's soft-hearted that we should care. I mean, these are sort of real numbers. All right, what about children? There's actually very few good studies on children still. I'll talk about two studies that have come out very recently. One was published in American Journal of Public Health last year. They got a lot of attention, finding that we have improved infant mortality and birth weight associated with increased minimum wages. This is another sort of state year difference in difference. They didn't really have most of the key controls, even like unemployment in there that we won't normally have, so people are outside the public health world are very nervous about citing this. But there was an NBR working paper that came out at the same time last year by a bunch of economists that essentially found something very similar. They were using a similar methodology, but they did it a little bit closer to how economists would want to see it, with some more falsification tests and looking at leads and lags and some controls, and lots of ways you could improve this. If we look at the effect sizes for this, if we're just talking about, say, a $1 increase in minimum wage, these authors are generally interpreting these as relatively small effects. But of course, if you're talking about a much bigger increase in minimum wage, these would be quite substantial effects on health. So in the American Journal of Public Health paper, what they're doing, they've estimated that there would be about 518 fewer postnatal deaths per year if we had a nationwide $1 increase in minimum wage. Which is much bigger than that increase in teen traffic deaths that we talked about, 100 per year, right? So that sort of swamps that adverse effect. But if we put a value of a statistical life year of, say, $10 million on this, it's still not very much money compared to that adult obesity effect that we talked about, right? This is like $5 billion sort of welfare gain, sort of interesting. The other paper, the NBR working paper that came out, they found a similar estimate on low birth weight. If we monetize these in terms of treatment on the treated effect of a $1,000 increased income from EITC, we get something like a 0.2 percentage point decrease in low birth weight. Just not huge, right? So 1 percentage point decrease in smoking among pregnant women. Again, so for a $1,000 income increase, that's not going to be huge. If we have a $5,000 income increase, that's actually really big. All right, so going forward, just to sort of summarize what I've been saying, based on the related literature such as EITC, I would anticipate that the health effects would be bigger, more important for kids than for adults in terms of what we're seeing, at least for short-run effects. These obesity effects that we saw by Meltzer and Chen that have this big welfare benefit, well, we worry a little bit about some of the numbers that they're using to scale those up to mortality effects. I think we really need to push this farther. But so going forward, we just need to get this literature up to the standards of the labor economics literature and the techniques that have been used to identify causal effects. More replication studies, more different types of health outcomes and mechanisms. I'd like to see some long-term effects of, a lot of these things happen with big lags. And then in terms of these sort of recent larger minimum wage increases are coming up, it would be really good if we had some new data that we could use to explore some of these things that had sort of big N on families and that have both the labor information and the health information. And then I think we could really nail a lot. And I think we might see some really substantial health impacts that will be really meaningful in policy discussions. But there has to be a real investment in the data infrastructure to do that. So thank you.
I have a few slides that are really more background, not as much related to specific findings that we just heard about, and really interesting work, both review of existing evidence by Will and as well as the child outcomes by Lindsay and the wage and the minimum wage contours by Bill. But I hope to have some sort of framing type information, and then I will discuss some of the specifics that came up, and hopefully you can kind of think about the context a little bit of some of these findings. So I think the general point, we heard sort of different from this morning, which was really just talking about employment and minimum wage, which I've spent way too much time thinking about in my last several decades, I guess. But the goal here is to broaden the outcomes in one way, and also to think more about the mechanisms a little more, as opposed to just a reduced form effect of minimum wage on even labor market outcomes. And so the broader set of outcomes, we sort of heard about, so the health, there could be hardships, and it could be a lot of other things that have to do with how people actually live and their different behaviors that have consequences. And doing this, it's helpful to keep in mind the channels. And the channels we heard about, we'll discuss some of both the direct income effects versus some of the other effects, like price effects. Because it's useful to think about in terms of, it's useful to keep in mind what kind of income effects there may be, because that gives you a plausibility check on what size, what effect size is reasonable, and is it accruing in that part of the distribution where you kind of expect it to happen. As a way of thinking about that, here are an estimates from one of my papers looking at minimum wages and the distribution of family incomes. This is sort of the quasi-experimental estimate of minimum wage increases. Let's just for a 10% increase in minimum wage. For our purpose, let's call that about $1 increase, because we heard a couple of dollar increases. It's a little less than that, but let's just go with $1 increase. And the y-axis, you have the change in income, right, by families. This is adjusted for family size, and the bottom axis is the percentile, right? So those right around the federal poverty threshold, right under the 15th percentile, about $1 increase in minimum wage may increase family incomes by upward of $700. There's depending on exact specification, the estimates vary somewhat, but it's in sort of over 500 range. But then there's also an offset. So what I find, for instance, is about a third of the increased income is offset as reduced in tax credit and non-cash transfers, in particular SNAP, EITC, child tax credit, et cetera. So all said and done, there's still quite a bit of an increase, more about $500 to $600 annually from that dollar increase. So then it's sort of useful to keep in mind, let's say, for instance, health outcomes. If whatever low birth weight, even if most of the low birth weight babies were in sort of the bottom 30% of the income distribution, that's an obvious exaggeration. Do we have sort of, is a $500 to $700 increase in family incomes, is that going to produce an estimate that is plausible. It may be, but it's useful to keep in mind. This is sort of your first stage, if you will, and then hopefully, as you're thinking about, for example, Will and others, in terms of thinking about the effect sizes, I think having the income sort of by quantiles is a useful thing to keep in mind. I just did some quick kind of back at the envelope calculations, thinking about, for example, the Lindsay, your paper. So I think you had sort of a $1 increase led to roughly a 10% reduction in neglect. And so if neglect was mostly towards the bottom, even if that were the case, so it would sort of suggest a pretty large effect of income. So as an example, it'd be sort of 10% increase in income, maybe about a 2 to 3% increase in family income. So 10%, a dollar increase in minimum wage, about 2 to 3% increase in the family income, to a 10% reduction in neglect. So that's a very big income elasticity of neglect. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Would be useful to sort of benchmark that with a EITC or other type of income increases. Do you sort of see family income elasticities of like 3 or something in that range? That would be actually interesting to sort of keep in mind. I think also it sounds very interesting when you talked about using the FFCWS data. So it'd be really interesting to sort of look at the effects by income deciles or something like that, and then sort of see, are they occurring kind of where you expect them to occur? That's I think part of what, Will, you were saying in terms of moving to having more falsification tests and more ways of assessing these are really causal effect. I think that becomes really important as people start looking at new outcomes, because obviously the number of new outcomes is a lot more than what I can list and anything. So then the multiple testing becomes an issue. So the chance you'll find something that is affected is non-trivial. And so especially as you kind of sort of look at new types of outcomes, I think those kind of falsification tests become particularly important as a way of guarding against some of the multiple testing concerns as well. So let me now turn to the other questions. In particular, talk about the minimum wage contour stuff that Bill discussed. Here, I think sort of going back to an earlier literature of dual labor market, segmented labor market, in many ways, I think labor economics has come back to some of those issues, although you may not sort of, recognize those phrases. I think I sort of see under the, sort of the importance of the firm. And I think there's increasing recognition that firms matter. And it seems kind of silly to say at a certain level, but not at another level. I think if you look at, for instance, the increase in inequality, it's striking that near 3/4 of the increase in inequality over the last several decades has been between firms, and that it has been essentially sort of high wage, high person effect workers going into high firm effect firms. In other words, basically, high wage workers have been able to get into high rent jobs is one way of putting it. So that sort of raises the question: how much do we understand about these firm wage policies? Firm effects matter, so firm wage policies matter, and how do they respond to shocks? And so here, I think there's a sort of really interesting think about when the minimum wage rises. Does it change the structure of the labor market in some fundamental way? One way may be reallocation of work between certain types of firm to other type of firms. There's some evidence, for example, by Aronson, French, and Sorkin, who find that there's minimum wage increases lead to reallocation from non-chain to chains. But that's pretty limited still, in my view. There's also a question whether or not firms are actually can change the type of jobs. And here, sort of the things you raise in terms of, are you changing changing the kind of jobs versus the kind of people? So your argument was that essentially those are different things. You could actually upgrade the jobs without necessarily changing the people, potentially with some training, or potentially just simply changing the job, the nature of the jobs. And then here it's sort of a really interesting question. It's like, how can firms do that or do firms do that, or do new firms do that? So sort of like thinking about, are there different vintages of firms and strategies that are in play, and to what extent do firms adapt, through themselves, or is it mainly through churn that we actually adjust that churn of the, in terms of new firms? These are some questions that I hope to sort of look at. With some new research doing with Matt Friedman, who's at UC Irvine. This is a funny thing, but I actually didn't know I was going to do this very soon until a couple of months ago. So in 2012, I put in an application for the LEHD data, which is sort of the linked employer-employee data. And I think like 3 months ago, Matt sent us an email saying, "Hey, the data just came in. We got 26 states now." So this allows us. I think one of the things we really want to look at are some of these questions. Does minimum wage actually lead to substantial reallocation, maybe from low wage to high wage firms? There's some, like new evidence from Germany that's suggestive of that may be going on. I think so. This is something that certainly I look forward to doing. But I think there's going to be increasing amount of research, and this is where I think having high quality administrative data can really help, because you can really try to get a better handle on some of the dynamics of our firms. Is employment changing across firms? Are workers changing across firms? And so forth. So let me stop here since my time is out, and thank you.
So as other folks have said, thank you for staying awake through the afternoon, because now it's post-nap coma time. So I wanted to focus mostly on the downstream effects on children. I think Will already gave a very helpful overview of basically everything related to health, child and otherwise, that we know about both income and the minimum wage. So I will largely skip that and focus on a few bigger picture things, income and children, and then this paucity of literature that we know exists on minimum wage and child outcomes specifically, but that Lindsay is very helpfully contributing to, and that I'm really excited to learn, especially just having been here in the last day, learn about what CWED has coming up on that pipeline, because I think it's a gap in literature. So then take a step back, look at the policy context, and then I have a couple specific comments and questions on Lindsay's paper. But to dive in, so I thought that when I saw Lindsay's title, the first two words, I was like, I don't really need to read further. I did, it was great. But money matters for kids. We know that from just a significant amount of literature. Will already talked about the health effects in particular, like Hillary's work on, you're not wrong, on the EITC, but there's also across several fields. We have really strong evidence. For example, Greg Duncan's done research on increasing children's low-income families' incomes by just $3,000 a year from the prenatal period to the age 5, results in an average 17% increase in adult earnings for those kids. There are substantial, there are effects from Dahl and Lochner and other research on educational outcomes when you just make modest increases in low-income families' incomes when kids are very young especially. There's ongoing research on brain development, so brain surface area and gray matter and other things that I am not qualified to speak to, by Kim Noble and her team of neuroscientists. So health, behavior, productivity, criminal activity, and so on. We know that income matters for children's outcomes. What we don't have good research on as a whole to date, but is starting to emerge now, as Will and Lindsay have said, is specifically the direct causal link between minimum wage increases and low-income children's long-term outcomes. So, but just taking for a second and flipping these findings on their heads, when you can quantify, as Will was helpfully doing for us, monetize some of these effects. If you turn that around and say, how much are we losing as an economy or as a society, in addition to the tremendous hardship and suffering that comes along with poverty, Harry Holzer and his colleagues estimated that child poverty costs the U.S. economy about 4% of GDP per year. That's not a causal study, but it's an estimate from existing literature that we can respect, I think. So what I wanted to do just quickly is say why I think this is a really important moment for this research literature. We know, as the minimum wage scholars in this room know, that the time has arrived when we're finally able to do some of this work, although the data on some of the children's long-term outcomes remain to be dug up on our part. Minimum wage researchers have finally this sort of richness of historical data. We also have a much greater the fact that it's now largely adults, as has been repeated, and not just teenagers, but adults often raising families and significantly impacting family income who are affected by minimum wage policy means that this is a really important moment. But I think there's a lot of fruit to be borne by also engaging children's advocacy groups, such as in the space that I work in DC, a lot of these partnerships happen between labor researchers or rather labor advocates and children's advocates. Getting more on the research side there would be very helpful. And I think there are some compelling points here. So from an advocacy perspective, for example, we know that that more than half of the kids who are born in America today are brown or black, and that families of color, parents of color, are disproportionately impacted by realities of low-wage work. Secondly, we've got a really regressive tax reform bill moving through Congress right now, and the White House and Congress have really signaled that welfare, by which they mean all social assistance programs, are next. And so that means that one of the biggest ways that we can impact children's outcomes as a progressive community, or at least speaking for my organization in the coming years, might actually be through raising parents' paychecks rather than programs that we are used to being able to affect kids. So from a more wonky perspective, I just wanted to point out, I think this is the case for some existing studies, but that static analysis relative to causal analysis sometimes tends to underestimate the policy impacts from, income and poverty. So a couple of examples here. So Hilary Hoynes' work on the EITC, for example, if you compare her work to on how much it improves poverty for children, she is estimating much larger effects than just static estimates from the census, for example. And then finally, a greater amount of causal analysis on the minimum wage will actually, I think, help make the case for policy changes that might be useful for kids in terms of, especially I'm thinking here, the timing of income. So right now we deliver a lot of social assistance through the tax code, specifically the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit. And the problem with that is that, like, if you need to buy diapers for your child, they don't wait until April, whereas your next paycheck may be coming in a week. And so comparing those ways of delivering income to families with children could help us strengthen the case for maybe it's making tax credits into periodic payments instead of just once a year. Maybe it's reinstating any kind of meaningful cash transfer. And so that, in addition, over and beyond increasing the minimum wage, which I think we already know from emerging literature is very beneficial to children, and I'm hoping we'll figure out a lot more about that in the coming years. Specifically on Lindsay's paper, a few things that I was curious about. So the first is that the major question for me that came out of this is what exactly is the channel and the pathway through which minimum wage is in fact affecting kids? And so are parents purely taking an increase in the minimum wage through greater paychecks, or are they instead choosing to spend some more time with their children, doing more supervising, since we know that largely these effects are on neglect and not abuse? I think it's an interesting further exploration what exactly is happening here, because that'll help us be able to tell whether, for example, what Will was teeing his talk up with, we know a lot about income, we don't know a lot about minimum wage. We'll be able to tell whether income is a good proxy, income increases are a good proxy for minimum wage if we can kind of delve into this question a little bit more. I think there are other maybe less plausible or less strong ways that a minimum wage increase could have the effects on maltreatment that Lindsay found, and that, satisfaction with your job, less stress, and so on, that might not have, in my mind, are less likely to have huge effects. But second question is, I'm curious where these neglect reports are largely coming from. One question is whether they're coming from schools, for example. If that were true, that would raise in my mind whether there's a possible interaction with like absenteeism. Is after a minimum wage increase that substantially increases parents' income, are kids more or less likely to show up at school or to show up in another place where they are exposed to the potential for reporting? I think that effect could go either way. And I'll skip this last one because it's an interesting aspect of the paper, but not something that was covered, where she stratifies the sets of states into those that are bound by the federal minimum wage and those that aren't. So I had some questions on those results that I will check in with her later. On the last thing I wanted to do is, and I won't cover these results fully, was just switch gears in terms of downstream impacts to mention some research that Michael and I did on, and that Ben has done in his own capacity as well, on the relationship between minimum wages and social assistance expenditures. So specifically for the two of us, we looked at nutrition assistance and we looked at Medicaid. The hypothesis we were working on is that for these means-tested programs, when families experience an income increase, social assistance spending on programs that low-income working families qualify for will decrease, because they will either get less in benefits or some will become ineligible. And we did in fact find that to be the case. I'm happy to talk about those results later. But the reason that I wanted to connect this is that I think there's a powerful narrative to be told here that both minimum wage researchers and advocates should be working on, which is sometimes distasteful, but we have found very influential, I think. It's kind of doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. So this, for example, the telling a policymaker raising the minimum wage will not only help workers, but it will save taxpayers $53 billion over the next decade in SNAP spending, for example. Sometimes that's going to get a moderate on board. I think we need to be thinking about that with downstream effects on children as well, and sort of monetizing that research. So I'll close there. Thank you.
Is there any chance I could respond to some of the comments that, okay, so I have 3 points that I'd like to respond to. So first, Erin's point, I think it's a great one that we should compare the income effects from minimum wage increases to other types of policy. In fact, I think it's so great that we did it. So just for example, so we didn't, our kind of back of the envelope analysis wasn't quite as in-depth as your study. So we didn't take into account things like reductions in benefits and other kind of transfers. But what we found is that an increase of, using the average of the previous several years, increases in minimum wage would yield about $1,200 increase to household incomes, which then would subsequently lead to the 10% reduction in child maltreatment reports. When we compare that to EITC and the child support enforcement programs, which both increased household incomes by $1,000 per year and $100 per year respectively, those two policies yielded about a 7% to 10% reduction in child maltreatment reports and 2% reduction. So for comparison, our study, 1,200 to 10%, the EITC paper, 1,000 increase in household income to 7 to 10% reduction. And the child support enforcement paper, $100 a year in household income increases to a 2% reduction. So I think it's probably, I mean, those sound very similar, and they sound also like they're quite linear in terms of their relationship. The other 2 points I had were to follow up on Rachel's comments. One, I completely agree that understanding the mechanisms for how minimum wage increases reduce child maltreatment risk is incredibly important. It has quite significant implications for how we should be approaching public policy. In fact, that's why we're working on it next. So at this point, I can't really identify, I can't rule anything out based on this first study, but we're hoping to dig into it much more in this subsequent study. The second point about where these reports are coming from, are they coming from schools? So these reports are coming from everywhere. Anyone who, it could be you who's reporting someone for child maltreatment. So these are coming from teachers, neighbors, family members, et cetera. And in fact, I think that if we were to see an increase in minimum wage reduce absenteeism, then we might actually expect the effects to go the other way. So now children are more present in schools and therefore more visible for teachers and other mandated reporters. So I would expect actually to then find the opposite effects of what we found. So that is all just to say, I mean, the bottom line is reports are coming from everywhere. But thank you both for your thoughtful comments.
No, I hope Erin continues to do the work. And again, I had done that in aggregate. So yes, I can't tell you in the 80s expansion whether the shifts within industry and occupational structure, whether that was within firm or whether that was a different set of firms expanding and realizing that there was a low-cost way to do it. So it'd be great to see work that might look at that question. And as you pointed out, this is very popular to look at low performance versus high performance firms. If you're going to create a path to low wages, then in fact, one should suspect they're going to be low productive firms because you let me do it that way. And there's a way to organize work around that. So I think it would be interesting to see if that's what we're doing. We know from the charts that we've seen, the huge gap between states where we've raised the minimum wage and the rest of the states. And so maybe this is geographic. Maybe a lot of what people are observing on the within firm high productivity, low productivity may in fact show up as being driven by, if I'm in a low wage regime state, then I can do it that way. And so I think it'll be interesting work. And if you have the 26 states, hopefully something like that will pop up. You'll have to find a way to get their occupation. So since you have it matched, maybe you can figure out their occupations to see if what they're shifting to, because the difference between the minimum wage and the average wage contour isn't necessarily readily apparent just from someone's wage, because it's are you in an occupation where the wages tend to be pushed because the reference point is the minimum wage. So I could see someone like in Ben's data, I could see two people and I could say, well, yeah, they're getting paid $5.60 instead of $5. But it could very well be they're on the average wage contour. They're being hired as an initial craftsperson, not as a handler. The handler is getting $5, but the handler isn't going to get another raise until their minimum wage goes up. That $5.60, I have to keep pace with, or I'm going to eventually have to raise their wages to get to the average wage for craft workers. And so they, in the initial phase, may not be readily apparent.
Thank you to Erin and Rachel for your thoughtful comments. I'll cede my time to the break.
I always have something to say. I'm concerned. I think we all need to look into this some more, into the basis for this data. So, in the child neglect data, anyone can report. And say obesity, I guess, it's a self-report, right? No? It's a doctor's report?
Some of the surveys are measured, actually, in that.
Okay. Or smoking. I mean, I know when Rachel and I did the SNAP and EITC studies, we found a lot of underreporting, and just usually something I think we all need to know about. The other point is that when you mentioned that the EITC results are similar to the minimum wage results, that's good news. But it's also true that if you put up a map of the minimum wage states and the state that have higher than federal minimum wage and the states that have higher than federal EITC, there's a huge amount of overlap. And so I think we all want to be taking a look at what happens when you look at the combined effects of the two. That's all.
I know Jared wants a cookie.
I want a cookie. I want your cookie. Since you pointed that way. This is for Rachel and others. I think there is some tension between this minimum wage leading to less expenditures on social safety net stuff, and I know I got a lot of calls from allies who are confused as to why that was helpful for us. And I don't have a good answer to that, but I just wondered if you had any more to say about it.
I have a perspective on it. I'm not sure if I have a good answer on it. I'm not sure what the answer would be. This is the research that I did while I was minion for Michael and Sylvia in part, it ended up being as part of a project for the Center for American Progress, where I now work, and I started out very ambivalent about it for that reason. I thought it couldn't possibly be helpful, and in fact was doing exactly the right thing for exactly the wrong reasons, and that it would threaten social assistance expenditures, and in particular threaten SNAP. I have since changed my tune on that, since I have seen how powerful it has been in DC. Berkeley is a wonderful place. It's an anomaly. We have the luxury here, I think, of being more purely progressive. When I got to DC, I saw how what it takes to get what kind of messaging it takes to get centrists and moderates on board with minimum wage increases, particularly larger ones. So for better or worse, I think it's been powerful.
Yeah. Not to put too fine. No, just very quickly. So you actually have talked to politicians or legislators. You
talked to Jerry Brown.
Who have been moved by this?
And Jerry Brown took my phone and put in his own personal email because he wanted to know why the state could save $1 billion on Medicaid costs.
Point taken.
And then soon after that, for many reasons, he passed $15.
But
That's good to know.
I think the reason people are torn is the same reason Larry was raising about the deficits.
Yeah.
Because, yes, it should absolutely be true that if we can have workers get paid more money, they really won't need SNAP. And that would, in fact, be the ideal world. The problem is that SNAP benefits are inadequate, so people are fearful that people will say, fine, let's let people get higher wages, we won't fix SNAP. So I think that's where the fear comes from. But I do think the reason why I really like the thing about the effect is that it raises the cost of a McDonald's hamburger is because if one makes the argument, look, daycare is very expensive. If you want to raise the wages of daycare workers to $15 an hour, you're now going to price out a lot of women who need daycare work. Because even if they get $15 an hour, it's going to be too expensive for them. And so let's subsidize daycare workers so we can get more daycare work at a price that would be affordable. Or let's do that. So that's, I want to produce more of a public good that has a very high labor cost content. How can I do it? And my argument, precisely over the work that you and Ben were Rachel, that you and Ben and Michael were doing, was, yes, but McDonald's hamburgers are not that public good. And my goodness, don't they kill us? So shouldn't you, in fact, say there should be no subsidy? The workers should be paid some unbelievable wage, and we should not be subsidizing workers in that industry in any way because they're not producing a public good. And so if it takes them getting paid $18 an hour so they can feed their families and have rent and not get food assistance, that's great. And if it means that people will eat fewer McDonald's hamburgers, that's even better, because look at the obesity problem we're going to solve. And it's a lot better than telling people I want to put a tax on a McDonald's hamburger. I mean,